friend of mine this week told me that he had decided to flood the world with empathy. He said, I am going to become a fire hose of empathy, spraying it wherever and whenever I can. I asked him why, and he said, there are lots of people right now in the world who are determined to flood the world with other things, like chaos and a need for power and even hatred. And he said, I know that I can't be all empathy all the time, and sometimes I'm going to have to turn down that fire hose and really think things through with my brain as well as my heart. But in the absence of anything else, he said, I would choose to flood the world with empathy. There's been a lot of conversation recently about empathy, even from other Christians who try to frame it as some sort of sin, which does not make a lot of sense to me. Some people look at empathy as a weakness, a way of not using our brains because we're only using our hearts. I've even heard people say that it is empathy, feeling for our fellow human beings, that somehow, by some convoluted logic, stands in the way of true justice in the world. And I have to tell you, as a follower of Jesus, that this framing does not make any sense to me at all. The word empathy means to feel within, to enter into someone else's suffering. It has the same root as the word compassion, to suffer with someone else, which is something, as far as I can tell, that Jesus did all the time. So I have a hard time seeing compassion, seeing empathy as something that somehow stands in the way of following Jesus, when to me, it is the way of Jesus. If you look at Christian art way sooner than the painting you're looking at right now, specifically Christian art of the Middle Ages, all of a sudden, when they paint Jesus, there's a lot more paintings of Jesus on the cross, right around the year 1400, 1500. And of those paintings, they're a lot gorier than they ever were before. There's lots of blood and guts, and they're kind of gross to look at. And it was such a significant turn that art historians were puzzled by this. These images did not exist before, and then right around the Middle Ages, they started becoming really graphic. There's even an image by painter Matthias Grunewald painting Jesus with very particular physical deformities that they'd never seen before. And when art historians studied what was actually going on in this painting, they discovered that Grunewald had painted Jesus with the same particular physical infirmities that the people of Grunewald's city were suffering because their grain had been contaminated and the people were slowly being poisoned. The reason, these historians argue, that the images of Jesus start portraying more suffering and more pain in the Middle Ages is because the people who were enduring things like the Black Plague were experiencing more suffering and more pain. And there was something powerful, they argued, for these artists to show the people a Jesus who was not above their suffering, but who entered fully into it with them. Because when we have a God who can enter fully into our suffering, it gives us hope that we can fully enter into God's resurrecting power. The first scripture that Sharon read for you this morning, that from 1 Kings, that book of the Bible we don't read an awful lot from, tells the story of the prophet Elijah, who's visiting a widow. He's been staying with her for a long time through a famine. She's received a voice of God saying, this guy's going to come to your house and you should let him in. And he's received a voice that said, you should go find a widow. So there's some kind of divine power at work in their meeting. He stays with her and somehow God feeds them, even in the middle of a famine. But while he's there, the widow's son dies. And she says, with understandable bitterness, Have you come to me, man of God, just to kill my child? But Elijah, as one who follows the Holy One of old, cries out to God and says, "Why would you do this? Have you wrought evil upon this person? Please, please let this child's soul come into him again." And Elijah throws himself down on the bed of the child 3 times, scripture says. Elijah, in this moment, even though he's a grumpy prophet who sometimes makes mistakes and has big mood swings, Elijah has compassion. Elijah has empathy for the people that he's staying with, the people really nearby, his landlady, if you will, and her son. And the widow's suffering, as bitter and hard and disillusioned as it is something that Elijah enters into as well. She says, "Why would God let this happen?" And Elijah says, "You know what? You're right. Why would God let this happen? It doesn't make any sense." And somehow, through his prayer, through his fervent compassion, the power of resurrection is released. And at the end of the story, Elijah is able to give the boy, restored to life, back to his mother. The second story you heard is a story of Jesus entering into someone's suffering, someone's sudden death. But it's not someone he knows well. Jesus is walking through the village of Nain, and he stumbles upon a funeral procession of strangers, as far as any indication in the scripture suggests. It's a funeral procession, and he quickly discerns that it's the only son of a widow. She will be left with nothing. Jesus has never met these people. All he can see is that this person is being held up by the entire village. He witnesses not just the suffering of this widow, but the tenderness of an entire community who loved this child very much. Maybe Jesus gets a vision. Jesus is prone to visions, after all. Maybe Jesus gets a vision of what his own mother will look like, cradling the body of her son after he dies. And somehow, in ways that are miraculous and strange, Scripture says that Jesus had compassion on the mother, told her not to cry, touched the coffin, and the dead man rose up and began to speak. Somehow, in ways that are miraculous and strange, resurrection power is released, and Jesus gives this boy back to his mother as well. Literal resurrections, where someone is dead and comes all the way back to life, are rare. They're rare even in the Bible. There's only maybe a few other stories, including the story of Jesus himself, where this happens. And I, to be honest with you, share Elijah's anguish in asking God why it is that some people live and some people die. Why some prayers seem to be answered with a yes, and other prayers don't seem to stop death. But what if that kind of interceding for someone else, saying, "God, you can't do this to this person," saying, "Person, you can't do this to this person." What if standing between someone and the forces of sin and death, what if that is what releases the power of resurrection? Even if it doesn't always stop the bad thing from happening. Empathy, compassion, is something that intercedes in this way. Empathy intercedes. Empathy interrupts. That's why it is so threatening to the forces of nationalism and empire. It interrupts what is about to happen. Empathy stands next to someone. If necessary, it stands in front of someone. Empathy throws itself on the breathless body of the beloved. It blesses the lifeless bodies and the lifeless places of our processions. Empathy holds up a mirror taking your suffering in and transforming it into our suffering, something that is shared, something that gives not power over, but power with, compassion, to suffer with. Last week, I got a chance to hear the preaching of Bishop Tracy Malone. She's the president right now of the United Methodist Council of Bishops. We don't have an archbishop, we have a president. And she preached about this kind of resurrection power, urging the leaders of our church not to deny that each of us has that kind of power inside of us, urging us not to comply in advance, not to go gently into that good night, as the poet has written, but to acknowledge the power that was within us as followers of Jesus and to do something with it. Bishop Malone says this: nothing is beyond the reach of Jesus, so lead like you believe it. Are we living right now as people with resurrection power? Because the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is the same power, the bishop says, that is within us. I believe that God resurrects us all the time. God pulls us back all the time from the brink of unending brokenness and emptiness and despair, back onto level ground, back to a place where we can face together a future with hope. I believe that God uses us, each of us, as instruments of that resurrection, giving us the right words and the right ideas and the right time to help pull other folks back from the brink. Friends, I do not know when or how resurrection will next burst into the world. Resurrection power does not tend to follow a predictable timeline. It's very frustrating that way. I do not know when or how I will be called upon to midwife the bringing back of life and hope and joy and possibility into this world. But I do know this: empathy is real. It's real. Compassion is real. And empathy and compassion flood the world with a love that is greater than anything you or I can imagine. A love that is purpose, a love that is power, and a love that can bring even the things that you were certain were way beyond hope. A love that can bring even those things.